So good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Strategic Learning and Adaptive Management Peer Community Meeting. For this meeting, we're planning for a lot of audience participation, and we really look forward to shaping the content of the meeting to be most relevant to you. So please be ready to use your voice. We want to hear from you. And again, welcome. Before we really dive in, we'd like to inform you that this session will be recorded and we're providing interpretation in French. So please, I'd like to invite everyone to select their preferred language for this session. You can do so by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting either English or French. You can choose to mute the original audio or listen to it at a lower volume. Also, we'll be having breakout rooms today. There will be 3 English rooms and 1 French room. If you want to be in the French-speaking breakout room, please message Meredith or even just drop it in the chat. Meredith will see, and let her know that you would like to be in the French-speaking breakout room. That way we can go ahead and get you put into that room before we go into breakout rooms. All right, so that takes care of the interpretation bit. I'd like to also introduce you to the facilitation team for this meeting. So first of all, I'm Jenny Haddle, the Senior Learning and Adaptive Management Specialist for IDEAL. I'm with Save the Children. I'm joined by Eleanor Bedford from Acute Insight, who will be moderating the discussion with our speakers. And then we have Nicole Helm, Eric Frias, Elisa Dickey, and Meredith Brown, who are also from Acute Insight. Some of those folks will be facilitating breakout rooms, so you'll see them in the breakout rooms. Meredith is here to support production and also provide technical support. So if you have any technical issues during the meeting, please message Meredith. Okay, so since we always have some new faces, I'd like to start the meeting with a brief intro to SLAM and IDEAL. Some of you may be very familiar with this, so bear with me, but the Strategic Learning and Adaptive Management Peer Community is hosted by IDEAL, which stands for Implementer-Led Design, Evidence, Analysis, and Learning Activity, which is funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. BHA works to support the United States government's goal of improving food and nutrition security among the world's most vulnerable households and communities. IDEAL addresses knowledge and capacity gaps expressed by the food and nutrition security implementing community, supporting them in the design and implementation of more effective emergency and non-emergency food security activities. But this community is specifically designed to bring together peers to share and discuss promising practices and issues around themes related to strategic learning and adaptive management. So our last meeting focused on using qualitative methods to increase gender and youth inclusion and was a little bit less participatory. So we really wanted to bring the audience voice to this meeting and open it up to hear from you in the peer community. So we have shaped today's session with that in mind. So during today's session, we'll be exploring the barriers to reflection and learning in humanitarian contexts. So as promised, and I hope that you saw this in the event webpage, this session will be interactive and it will build off concerns raised by all of you. So as such, we're really kind of going against the grain, and we're going to start our session today in breakout rooms. Please don't drop off when we go into breakout rooms. We want to hear from you. It's a safe space, so embrace that and be ready to share your experience. We'll spend 20 minutes meeting each other, and we'll discuss the question, what are barriers that you perceive or have experienced when conducting reflection and learning in humanitarian contexts or emergency programs? So after breakout rooms, we'll come back to plenary, and we'll hear from the facilitators of each breakout room what themes were emerging from their discussion. Those themes are going to help us guide the second part of today's meeting, which is a moderated discussion with our 2 speakers, Grace Chabet and Brenda Barrett. So Grace comes to us from Mercy Corps, Nigeria, where she serves as the country MEL manager supporting 11 programs. She formulates MEL strategies and sets up M&E systems, and is especially interested in improving knowledge management and evidence-based learning in remote and crisis-affected contexts. Brenda is the Senior Director of the Peacebuilding, Stabilization, and Transition Portfolio at Nickel Global Solutions. She has more than 20 years of experience in democracy and governance programming, and has worked in 25 countries, including politically complex contexts in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Haiti, on and on. Most recently, Brenda was the chief of party for 3 consecutive USAID programs in Burma from 2015 to 2023. Brenda's experience includes working at USAID OTI at both headquarters and embassies and missions abroad, as well as with the United Nations Refugee Agency, Peace Corps, and private contracting world. So, as you can see, we have a wealth of experience coming from both of our speakers today, and we're really excited to hear more about how they have navigated challenges to reflection and learning in their own work. So before we hear from them, we want to hear from you. As I have warned you, we will go into breakout rooms for 20 minutes with facilitators. We're not leaving you on your own. We will be there to help out. Those facilitators will also be taking notes so that we can share the discussion in plenary. Once we get into our rooms, the facilitators will guide you. If you end up in an English-speaking room and would prefer to be in a French-speaking room, please send a message to Meredith and she will move you. Okay, so let's go into breakout rooms and have a brief discussion about this topic. What are barriers to reflection and learning that you've encountered? Great. All right, so we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from each facilitator of each group to get an idea of what was discussed in each group. I have a lot in my group, so I suspect that there is a lot in each group. So let's just limit it to maybe 2 or 3 factors that you discussed in the group and add on new ones as we move on, right? So if your group discussed one that hasn't been mentioned, please make sure to share that as well. So I am going to start with Elisa, who was facilitating the group of French speakers. So Elisa, would you like to share with us?
Merci Jenny. Dans notre très petit groupe en France.
Thank you, Jenny. In our very small French-speaking group, we spoke about a few themes. First, sometimes projects are developed in a very standardized fashion, but when you get to the communities, you see that you have to do a lot of adaptation work, but the funding organizations do not really want to change the project once it's already started, don't want to make these adaptations, especially once a project has been developed. So that was another theme, communication with financing organizations. We also talked about resources, either budget changes to make adaptation possible, but also time resources, human resources. They're all needed to put time aside for reflection and then to focus on fast and effective implementation. Thanks very much to everyone in my group.
Thank you, Lisa, for those contributions. Nicole, would you like to share a couple contributions from your group?
Sure. I won't go into too many to leave some room for everyone else, but I think we talked about a lot of the enabling factors, especially trust within the group, trust and reflections on performance, talking about failures or just challenges in general, wanting a positive perception of how performance is going for, not being sure how the information is really going to be used, and if it would have any negative impacts on individuals who are sharing openly. And so that issue of trust, trust building within a group, And then of course, the competing priorities that come up frequently, right? Yes, we care about it. Yes, we want to do it. Yes, it's important. But when it comes down to prioritizing, additional data collection versus, handing out important, food or financial resources, it's really hard to prioritize. So we had a couple others as well, but I'll see if they appear in some of the other groups. And if not, I'll add them in.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Eric, please share.
Excellent, thank you. So really engaging discussion. A lot of the points that have been hit already, but perhaps some that have not would be knowing the what to do and the why, but not necessarily having the justification or how to get the research to justify it to the donor. And so that then becomes the barrier. And then there was also professional and institutional agency norms. So it kind of overlaps with the expertise and the needing to know everything, but also recognizing that there is bureaucracy within those norms that can make it challenging and impact timing, etc. So last one is also just the operationalization of learnings. Great, we learned something, how do we put it into action?
Interesting, thank you, Eric. Okay, I'm gonna add a few more from our group discussion as well. And I think that will round it out nicely before we hand it over to our speakers today. A couple things that came up in our group really were around and these two issues are connected actually, lack of understanding of the importance of reflection and learning. Why should we be doing this? Both Sangeeta and Florence brought this up, and Florence mentioned that many people think, well, we're doing a very simple intervention here. We're just giving cash to communities. Well, why do we need to learn from that? What is there to learn? And so just justifying the actual importance of reflection and learning. Something else that came up was around the short-term contracts of staff. This kind of has to do with resources, but just around how to engage staff that are only contracted for a short period of time in the organizational learning to get them interested and want to engage in that kind of learning. And then maybe the last one I want to bring up is also then engaging the community in reflection and learning, and not only engaging, but helping the community to feel connected in a way that they do want to spend time reflecting and learning, and then considering and contributing in ways that help to create programming or interventions, whatever, things that are more effective for the situation that they are in. So those are some of the issues that I came up with. How much time? We have about 4 minutes left. If there are any other contributions from the other groups that have not been mentioned, I'll open it up to my facilitators, or even people within the groups. If there's anything that you would like to share that you feel was very important, we have a few more minutes.
I'll just add a couple of points. This is Nicole, that I didn't mention, which is who's involved in the conversation. That sometimes conversations around learning are limited to management and not the full team. And so that's an important piece of it as well. We also had a conversation around resources, and I think our team really felt that resources on individual projects wasn't as much of a financial resources, wasn't as much of a barrier as resources when you're looking at trying to learn across projects. And that's when you see more of the financial challenges, and really more of the barriers have more to do with sort of that trust building and that enabling environment than the finances and also the trust building with the donor, that the donor really does want to fund these projects, that they are serious when they say, please dedicate resources to M&E and learning, that they really do mean it. So those are just a couple other points I noted from our group.
Thanks, Nicole. Eric, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I think one other important point that came up in our conversation was that there's so much tacit knowledge that is not there's not a means of communicating that to the rest of the team. And a lot of the explicit knowledge being shared via email or via SharePoint, that it's difficult to really engage around a conversation around that. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we can take the time now to transition to the next part of our meeting. We are going to have a facilitated discussion with Grace and Brenda, who I've already introduced. Eleanor is going to moderate that discussion. It's going to be a 30-minute discussion. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, or if there are experiences that come to your mind as you are listening to Brenda and Grace, also feel free to drop those in the chat. This is an exchange. After those 30 minutes, we'll have 15 minutes to open it up to the audience to ask questions and also to share your experiences. If you don't feel that, or if you feel that there's something that you have done to help solve some of these issues or to get around some of these issues and it wasn't expressed by Brenda or Grace, we would love to hear from you. All right, so be thinking about that. There will be 15 minutes towards the end of this meeting for the audience members to share their experiences and ask questions as well. Thank you so much for your participation in the breakout rooms. Fantastic information that we received, and now we have a lot for Brenda and Grace to talk about. I'm going to pass it over to Eleanor to take the next portion of the meeting.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks again, Brenda and Grace, for being here with us. Before we dive in, I just wanted to hear from each of you. What is it that really has made you passionate about this particular topic of continual learning in these really complex environments? Grace, you want to just take a minute to sort of reintroduce yourself and share with us what you really appreciate about this particular topic?
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on the time zones. To repeat again, I'm Grace Chebet. I'm the country mail manager for Mercy Corps Nigeria, based in Borno State, that is the northern part of Nigeria, where we are implementing the humanitarian programs, working with displaced persons and persons affected by crises. That has been going on since 2012. I think from the discussions in the breakout rooms, one thing I can mention is that the conversations were really interesting, and it was very easy for me to resonate with the topics of the discussions. And some of them I could say I have experienced them, and some of them I would say learning is a continuous process, and some of them we still get to experience them on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things I can say about reflection and learning is that it is a very crucial component for an organization to have, and mostly in humanitarian contexts, looking at what exactly we are doing and how within the time frame we're doing this, how is it impacting in the lives of the programs, in the lives of the beneficiaries and the participants that we're working in. Learning is one of the ways that we can take time to pause and reflect and see how best we can improve on our program implementation in terms of to ensure efficiency and effectiveness, and how we can overcome implementation barriers and how we can constantly improve in our outcomes as a program. And at the end goal, of course, is to realize the program objectives. In terms of some of the barriers, I was taking notes on some of the barriers that you have mentioned, one of them including the time factor. Looking at emergency situations where we may have 6 months or maybe 1 year to respond, it takes time for a program to be dedicated fully and say, we want to pause our interventions, take time to pause and reflect. Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing implementation correctly? Even after the 6 months, after that a response is done to the program participants who have been affected, do we take time to reflect on how exactly our activities were undertaken. So I can say time factor is really one of the excuses we have given in terms of taking time to learn in humanitarian context. Competing priorities, sincerely, competing priorities is something else. What do we focus on? Do we focus on activity implementation, or do we focus on taking time to sit and learn? Another things that you've mentioned, I could say others we have is involving the right people when it comes to learning, and also limited resources in terms of budgets. I could say that addressing these barriers requires multi-approaches, including fostering and instilling the culture of learning within the organization, providing dedicated time, and also ensuring that we have resources for learning. It also includes having open and genuine conversations and communications, feedback mechanisms within the room, and ensure that all the teams, the relevant teams, are carried along when it comes to reflection and learning within the organizations. I will stop here for now, and I think we'll carry on with the discussion. Thank you.
Grace, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to diving into each one of those things that you pulled out from listening to the groups a little bit further. Brenda, first over to you to share a minute or two about your experience and what makes this so extremely relevant for your work.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. Most of what I'm sort of bringing to the table today is based on my experience for the past 20 plus years in the field, mostly as a chief of party for USAID programs. My current position right now, I sort of oversee programs, and my job is a little bit different, but it's the same. And what is the same is that I try to foster a culture of learning. And I guess that I was probably the biggest barrier to all of this earlier in my career. And so I understand very, very well the psychological aversion that some people have, whether you're sort of a leader or this is just, you're doing distribution of goods or services. So in our group, we discuss quite a lot the barriers, specifically that, the time constraints, and then just the sort of willingness and understanding the value of it, which I think is a challenge and remains a challenge everywhere. I understand that, and I think that there are ways to build into the way that we do things, the learning, so that it's actually just part of the rhythm and the routine of what you do. I mean, I don't know if we can wait until later to kind of discuss them, but I mean, the barriers are always going to be the urgency and time pressure. No one has time for this, okay, ever. It's always an issue, or they think they don't. But I think it's the way that we set it up that makes it intimidating, and sometimes, and so that's why. Resource constraints, which can be financial or human resources. We discussed a bit in our group about actually, it's not always going to be a financial constraint, right? Because sometimes you can just build this into the way we discuss with our own team and with folks in the community. Just changes all the time. I mean, whether it's a natural disaster or it's a political change, right? That makes things more difficult. There's the cultural and organizational resistance. Certainly there's a lack of collaboration. I think sometimes this gets siloed, and it feels like it's one person's job or one team's job, and no one else cares, and they just want to do their job. And I think, that the sort of short-term focus of a lot of the work that we do kind of also kind of presents a barrier, like, let's just do this one thing. Let's just do this one thing. Let's just get over this one thing. And next thing you know, it's years of doing this one thing that we haven't really harvested enough learning from. And then finally, one point, and I think what I'm passionate about, and the reason I care so much about it is psychological. I think that it's really a good way to build a team. And I have found out over time that if you bring people along with the learning, you actually strengthen your team and have them invested from the beginning to the end in what you're doing. So it's good for everyone involved. I'll stop there. I have more to say, but I'll wait for more questions. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. A whole team approach to learning is certainly something both of you mentioned. Why don't we just dive right in and hear from your experiences about an activity? How have you intentionally made time and space for your team to reflect on and distill learning from your activities? Grace, do you want to share with us specific CLA activities that you do or specific innovations that you've done in order to make time? This is the one common thread across all of the breakout rooms, was perceived lack of time.
Thank you so much. I think I would talk about one experience we did go through some time back, and this was more of an emergency activity. And after a cyclone attack and in one of the countries in Africa, and for some reason, for a good reason, we did end up getting small emergency funds from the Swedish government to intervene. And it was more of a 6 months interventions to go in, register, identify the displaced persons, register these persons, support these persons, and after collect data, that is the post-distribution monitoring data, and then after that come back. So we had a span of 6 months to do all this. And I can say within that span, it was a bit hard for us to take time to plan the process of the activity implementation. It was also a bit hard for us to also take time to plan and see how best we're going to collect data to see whether our interventions was actually conducted in the right way or not, considering these displaced persons would also be relocated within that same period, 6 months period, to another place, considering their own temporary shelter. I can say being the main lead for that particular program, it was a bit hard for me to structure all this and ensure that we collect learning, not only on reflecting on our activity implementation, but also reflecting on and collecting feedback from our participants, whether our interventions was correct and we served them diligently with the dignity that they deserved as humanitarian participants. But it took quite a lot of time went into planning. A lot of time went into planning from the M&D side. And one of the things I can say is that with a lot of buy-in also had to be gotten from our head of programs, so that way at least we could ensure that all our activities, everything that we were planning in terms of learning and reflecting on our entire activity implementation over the 6 month period was captured. So I would say it took a lot of deliberate buy-in from the program leads why we would want to conduct a reflection session on this particular activity. After the buy-in from the program leads, we had to structure and document key processes and activities that we wanted to undertake in terms of learning within that 6 months. Already, as we were sitting back and drafting all this, the program teams were in the field undertaking the registration processes. They had to go in and support people, displaced persons. So it was more of planning on our end while the real activity implementation was going on. After the registration process and the activity implementation started, we did take time to identify these participants and go into develop a short questionnaire on what they thought about our implementation strategy, whether this was correct or they felt we could have done better. We also did take time to identify the stakeholders that supported us on ground in terms of coordinating this activity implementation and getting their feedback in general on what they thought about their processes. Good thing I can say is that we did also put in a caveat in terms of being able to reach these program participants after that particular program implementation. And I can say we did not undertake learning within the 6 months period, but after that 6 month period, after the program implementation, we did have a session internally. We did develop planning questions. What exactly did we want to see during this program implementation? What were the unintended outcomes that did come out of this short-term program implementation? what can we actually improve on in instances where we have another event, another attack, and for some reason we were forced to intervene. What would we want to do better? And all this was, part of it was reflections from the team, and also part of it was also the data that we consolidated from program beneficiaries and also the stakeholders that worked very closely with us to ensure that we intervene. All of it, the fact that we made the session a bit quite participatory, in the sense that data was collected from all these different angles, program participants, stakeholders, and also the emergency response teams themselves, and also a bit of buy-in from the program leads and them being there to listen. It was a bit of a reflection session, not only for us as MND, but it was more of a reflection session in terms of the program teams, for them to also reflect on, do they feel that they responded the best they could? What exactly did they expect, or did they plan for, that when they reached there, they found out it was a bit different. So developing these learning questions that guided us in terms of our discussions, in terms of how exactly would we want to see, what exactly would we want to see come out of these discussions, really supported us to get clear objectives and clear action points on what exactly we'd like to improve on. In case there's a similar intervention, what exactly would we do different? I would say also I acknowledge the buy-in from and the support that we received from the program leads, and I also acknowledge the planning efforts that went into to ensure that we were still able to capture all this information within a 6 months period, and also program participants and also the stakeholders to ensure that they were able to give us information over the phone, even post the program implementation period. But a lot of planning did go into it. Yeah.
Fantastic, Grace. So I heard getting buy-in from program leadership at the outset for all of the time that, as you just described, this was really going to take was key. And the specific CLA activity that sounds like very valuable was designing collaboratively learning questions that saw through all of this from start to finish. Brenda, what about you? How have you addressed this key question? And there was actually a question in the chat a moment ago for you.
Well, so they're similar. I would say, just to be clear, I think it was earlier on in my career before I became a COP, let's say managing a field office, where I didn't maybe in the beginning didn't understand or appreciate the value of this. And so the answer to this question is, it came somewhat organically because I thought it was good team building for everyone to share in the work that we were doing and to hear, but it made us more effective. Honestly, it made us more effective at what we were doing. And so the tools that I would use to institutionalize the culture of learning, I still use today. I mean, I did a lot of grants. So it was, if you, the grant idea, you have to come with, why is it relevant? How will you know? And bringing everybody on board with it, everybody on the team, and whether it's finance or admin, everyone had to be sort of rowing in the same direction. So they had to, be invested in that. I would write into each person's scope of work some element of program learning that they had to contribute to, so that it didn't fall on one person's plate exclusively. Everyone contributed to that. And I would schedule regular meetings. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the need to create simple tools that people can use. The tools aren't only going to be something technological or some Excel spreadsheet. It's really going to be like a meeting structure too. So regular meetings with clear agendas where everyone's reporting out on the same kinds of things, to create a culture of learning, but also to demystify what's happening and to really remove the fear that maybe is associated from so many of the barriers we've heard today, which some of them are psychological, but some of them are fear about, feeling like they failed. If you really kind of create this environment, especially when you do get to a position of leadership or management, really fostering that environment that there is no failure from everything, and then you feed that learning immediately back into the next thing you're doing. That is the cycle. And then you intentionally pause and reflect on a regular basis, regardless of what's going on. Doesn't matter. Sometimes it feels like it's a step back, but what I have found, and a step away from really an urgent matter, but what I have found is that it builds your team, and then you come back stronger, and everyone is more invested in the situation. So you're building resilience in your team by doing this. I know we're at kind of close to time, so Eleanor, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, Brenda. Again, I love the emphasis on one team approach. Everyone on the team needs to understand why we're doing this and why we're all going to be investing as much time as it sometimes takes. A question for both of you, and Grace, I'll turn it to you first. If you could give one piece of advice to your peers in this community, hoping to establish a culture of reflection and learning, which is really the basis for all of this, what would it be? One piece of advice. I think Grace looks like she's frozen. Grace, can you hear us? She may have bandwidth issues. Brenda, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get her back.
Yeah.
I mean, one piece of advice is to just keep, to psychologically sort of step back and remember the why of what we're doing, and give everyone, it's kind of like, sort of an anecdote or something that they can take with them. I mean, that's good for donors. It's good for your teammates. It's good for your HQ, everyone. Like, just what is the one thing that they can take away from this? Like, it's a valuable, whether it's an anecdote, a saying, something someone said, or aggregated input from a community that you assisted. I think those things are always effective, and they serve to keep people motivated to continue to do this. I see we have Grace back, so I'll turn it back. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Brenda. Grace, glad you got back so quickly. What's one piece of advice that you have for your colleagues in this community?
Sorry about that. So I would say if there was one piece of advice I would give revolving around learning is learning is a continuous process. There's no end towards learning, and that is why they say there's only room for improvement. Learning itself is a continuous process. I would say integrate learning as in your day-to-day activities, in your work plan, in the program budgets as much as possible. It's not a standalone activity. It's not something that can be done at a particular point within the program management cycle. It's in each step of the program management cycle, learning can be instilled, and you can always pick one or two things that you may always want to do better. Set aside, be specific, be very much intentional when it comes to learning. Set aside time for learning, prioritize learning. I would say budget for learning, develop structures and dissemination formats for learning. Identify it's a bit much. Identify what types of learning you would want to disseminate to which particular stakeholders. Streamline learning as much as possible into your programs, and take up ownership also, so much of ownership of learning, not only for the M&D teams, but also for the program teams and also for the support teams. It really helps to ease a lot of burden when it comes to specific department bearing the burden of learning. And there's always room to improve. If we collect data, we can always use data to plow back into program management and see how best we can improve our program implementations. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Grace. I'm going to actually drop a key question into the chat that is for anyone as we continue our conversation and open it up for questions. Lots of people have examples of one activity improvement that they made that can really give us all inspiration in terms of what changed, concrete examples of what changed as a result of collaborative learning and adapting. So please share in the chat, raise your hand.
Can I respond? There was one question in the chat, Eleanor, about one piece of advice that we would give to major donors to support genuine learning cultures and the programs they support. That's a great question, and it's related to what Grace just said about funding, leaking funding to sort of the approach. mean, it's all well and good to have this, culture of learning, but if there's no way to turn that into a change in sort of real time about the way you're operating, then really what good is it, right? So the idea would be that you're able to create a culture where there's learning and then there's action, right? And so I think if a donor is very serious about this, and this came up in our small breakout room too, they have to fund it. They have to allow for the funding of it, right? So they call for it in the request for proposals. And then I think one way to follow through with that is in the deliverables that are required in the management of that agreement between the donor and the recipient would be, okay, I want reports out on this. Again, doesn't have to be onerous, can be super simple. I think it should be communicated on a very regular basis, by the way, like informally, in addition to the formal submission of reports. It's so important, especially because you get buy-in in real time as things are changing. Otherwise, it just becomes just one more thing to do, which of course what we're trying to do is incorporate it into the day-to-day such that it really helps inform people and that they have a role in giving information back to help shape and improve their program and their programming approach. So fund it. And then allow for the discussion around it in real time after the award is made.
Great. I would add to that, donors need to be really explicit about the expectation that things will change. Everything will change. Change is a good thing because it indicates continual learning. Appreciating all of the comments into the chat. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you have questions for our panelists, or drop additional questions or observations into the chat. While we're waiting to see what emerges, either Brenda or Grace, I go back to this idea of demonstrating what changed. How have you demonstrated a concrete change from any program that you've worked on as a direct result of learning?
Can you repeat the question, Eleanor?
What's a concrete change that was made in one of the programs that you were involved in that was a direct result of intentional learning? And how did that improvement, that change, impact the affected communities?
For me, one quick example that comes to mind was in Burma, and for a period of time, we were working in only geographically isolated places, the 3 most conflict affected areas in the country. And after but there's still big places. And so we had limited resources, financial and human. So how do you target the communities that make the most sense? It's not just the neediest. We weren't a needs-based program, right? And so it was a kind of setting up the systems I mentioned earlier. I mean, the simple tools that everyone's involved in, everyone feeds into the analysis about where to work, and then how it's going. And I mean, you can have an idea of, okay, this place for these reasons, but then when you're when you're doing the work, you realize that actually this isn't going to be the most effective place to create the biggest impact. And so sometimes you really have follow through and do the right thing to like finish up what you started, but then completely change. And then so changing locations of the work that we were doing and the approach that we were doing, and doing it in such a way that we weren't burning bridges, that we hadn't raised expectations that we couldn't follow up and follow through on, which required excellent communication skills for my team, but also just good community relations. So changing a geographic area would be one as a result of learning, which is the first one that comes to my mind. Grace maybe has others.
What about you, Grace? A concrete
Concrete? Just repeat the question, please.
So a concrete example of something that changed for the better based on some of the continual learning, intentional learning and reflection you were doing with your team at the time. What changed programmatically as a result?
I think I would say here in the humanitarian context was I would say a lot of one thing that has changed based on a lot of learning and reflection sessions programmatically is when we have different sectors implementing totally different interventions, be it protection, be it wash, be it agriculture, and they're doing different types of interventions. And most of the times you find that what we are doing independently as sectors is or could be actually built on another particular sector. Or you'd find an instance or a scenario where a sector is working with totally different cohorts of participants that are totally different from what another sector is implementing. I can say that within our pause and reflect sections, what we have sat down and discovered is that we do not really have to work in silos when it comes to program implementation. Different sectors can harness their efforts and ensure that much of what they're doing in terms of program implementation can still be done jointly as one. For example, I would give two examples. One is we have the protection sector, and the other one we have the agriculture sector. One of the things from collaboration and learning that we have discovered is with the safe spaces in our protection sector, we can actually bring in aspects of agriculture and support modern agricultural practices within the safe spaces. So for women and girls in the safe spaces that are actually staying there for a month, 2 months, or 3 months, as they're waiting to be transitioned or relocated to a more permanent safe space, undertaking activities or activities that support agriculture within that particular compound, so that way at least their minds is a bit occupied. So within our pause and reflect sessions, our learning sessions, we've discovered that programs do not really have to work independently. We can actually build so much and work connectively together. That way, at least we can be able to achieve the same objective, because we're all driven by the same theory of change. We're all driven by the same organizational objectives. So we really do not have to work in silos. We can see how best we can build and coordinate our efforts together so that we can all realize the same outcome. I know sometimes it can be a bit difficult to harness that within the different sectors that we work with, but a lot of reflection sessions, a lot of negotiations, a lot of collaboration goes into this to see how best we can reduce lead time instead of working independently with the resources available.
Thanks, Grace. So busting silos in order to bust barriers to learning. Ailish, I see your hand raised. Please come off mute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Grace. Actually, I think it builds well on that. So I've put fear of failure in the chat. So I'm with one of the Kenya RIFSs. We're almost 5 years into the 8 years. And we're well resourced for learning. We have, a dedicated CLA team, which is amazing and just wonderful, and have been actively nurturing culture of learning, building on what Brenda added, honestly, for 5 years. It's so tough, don't give up, keep fighting for time, keep fighting for space. But the fear of failure, and I know, so South Africa and Somalia I've worked in, and they don't fall into this at all. But Kenya, as an example, it's a very hierarchical culture. People get quite shocked. If certain people are in the room, just by virtue of being the COP or DCOP, or even a senior manager, often 90% of people will not share honest reflection and learning. And I think that's where, most people, in societies like Northern Kenya, ASALs, arid and semi-arid zones, to get a job even at, in quotes, the lowest level with a consortium like the Kenya IFSA is amazing and such a fantastic opportunity. And at every level, people come in because they've been seen to succeed. And so fear of failure might be a bit strong, but fear of being seen or painted in a negative light, even if you yourself know that you need to share that for learning and adaptive programming. It's very, very deep. And there's so many workshops I've been in where if certain people aren't there, the discussion and reflections on learning is so deep. And it works both ways. If one or two others are there, that won't happen. And I think it's, you know, going back to professional norms, agency norms, and what Grace just said, it's such a competitive environment. We have 5, 6 consortium partners. They're still competing. And the chief of party has been like, we're one consortium from day one. And then when you hear from field staff, they're competing in the field. They're going in separate cars. I mean, it's unbelievable after 5 years, but this is very normal. So it relates to, we have to show our best face, and it's very long-term, intentional, has to be very well supported to start changing those cultures. Sorry to dominate.
No, Eilish, really, really relevant observation. Thank you so much. It's all about the intercultural competence that it takes to create the foundation for this kind of learning from the very outset. Lloyd, I see your hand raised, and thank you for your contribution to the chat earlier. Please come off mute. Are you off mute, Lloyd?
Lloyd, your mic isn't on.
How does that work? I'm so sorry.
All right.
No, I was saying I would almost pivot that to an action item for the room too, around, because that fear of failure is a real thing. I talk about it a lot. I try to promote impact evaluations in humanitarian contexts, and there's, instead of fear of failure, we call it like there's this reputational risk. People are always kind of scared of what the reputational repercussions of any type of learning endeavor will be. And I think some of the language we can start using as a community in this is, we need to get away from this idea of evaluation being an accountability. Like, we've got to downplay the accountability component, even though the name of one of the teams that sits on every humanitarian or development activity is monitoring and evaluation. But starting to socialize in our own organizations that evaluation is not necessarily an accountability mechanism, that it is a learning mechanism. And it's not necessarily saying, did we do good or bad? We're really saying, oh, how can we do better? And I think some of these shifts in our teams, like it's going to percolate from the bottom up in terms of changing the culture that Eilish has talked about. It's not something that there's going to be a top-down policy decision that magically makes learning like an effective outcome across organizations. It really starts here with those of us in the room and kind of how we manage our own teams and people. So that's all. Thank you for my soapbox.
Thanks. That's critical, Lloyd. Thank you so much for raising that. And a sort of related question here from Yusuf in the chat, which is, in pause and reflect sessions, after action reviews, other learning-oriented meetings, what's the optimal approach to minimize influence, especially considering not everyone holds decision-making authority for adaptive actions? So again, these kinds of cultural, hierarchical concerns. What are some approaches that you two have taken in these kinds of facilitated learning environments?
For me, a lot of the places I've worked, is, you know, there is a hierarchy as well. And then there's an ethnic dimension where you have maybe an ethnic majority, an ethnic minority, and then you have gender issues. So to sort of try to institutionally solve for all of those things so that we level the playing field, the tools and systems that we use are equal for everyone. Some of the information that gets fed back isn't, I didn't always require people to say it, you know, in a meeting, recognizing some of those barriers, especially if there were strangers in the room. There are also security dynamics. So I think it's just having, for example, we had a database, folks could just write into that. There are tools that could be used that you could do anonymous surveys, which I did all the time, just to kind of really solicit input from folks to see how things were going. That's one tactic. The other is making sure that there are different ways people can communicate with you, regardless of who you are. Like if you're the boss, it's one thing, but even if your manager, and then they can convey the information. A lot of times when we were dealing with difficult situations where the information wasn't always positive, I would take it upon myself to deliver it and answer questions to sort of kind of keep the team's cohesiveness intact, and then just kind of field the questions and issues myself. I realize that's not always possible for a variety of reasons, but I mean, I think those are certain ways where if you're institutionalizing reflection and learning, and you create the tools that are needed, then as the information comes out, it sort of speaks for itself.
Right.
One way.
Thanks, Brenda. Grace, what about you?
I think over the past few years, instilling the culture of learning has taken a different shape in my mind. At first, it was more of, we need to do this, we have to do this, we need to collect this data, we need to analyze this data, we need to present this data. But over the time, I can say that this has changed for me. I can say taking time to reflect on organizational goals and commitments, looking at our strategic document, what do we have, our 5-year plan, our annual plan, looking at the donor commitments, and identifying objectives or opportunities for learning centered around this. It really helped me to not only get in the buy-in of the relevant program leads, but also for my immediate supervisor. Because if you tie it to that goal, if you tie it to the organizational objective, they tend to understand why you want to conduct this and why you want to do this and how this will generally improve the processes. Of course, reflecting different learning points, how this will affect our overall evaluations for the program, how this would affect our program implementation, but tying it to the organizational goal and also the donor commitments. I would say another thing, approach that I've really tried to take is discussing with the program leads and also discussing with the sector leads, and reflecting more of their interests than my particular interests. So reflecting on learning more of how this will benefit that particular program in that particular sector, and how this will affect the overall processes in terms of program implementation, and using that to advocate for this learning activity. So reflecting on that and looking at it more of how much they gain from us doing this, and how this affects their processes rather than how this affects me, for example, in the M&D department. Yeah, I think mostly those.
Thanks, Grace. I love your highlighting the importance of keeping the big picture in mind at all times, right? Having everyone understand those strategic imperatives and feeling like they have a role to contribute in achieving them and adapting as you go. Lawrence, thanks for your contributions in the chat. We have just a few more minutes. Jenny, how are we doing on time? We have time for any last questions?
4 or 5 minutes. Go ahead. If anybody has another question, I think we have a little bit of time.
If anyone's had anything burning that they were just waiting to contribute, now is the time to either put it in the chat or take yourself off mute.
Hi, Eleanor. I think I can ask a question since I have this opportunity. I think one thing that both Grace and Brenda have highlighted as they were speaking was incentives, like creating those incentives, making sure that the team is interested. What are some practical ways of doing this? Or when we say incentives, like what does that look like?
Practical incentives, really clear. Grace or Brenda, any experience with creating practical incentives?
Okay, thank you, Florence. I think that is a good one. And I would like to just tag in Lloyd on this. After the Ideal workshop, the last time I participated in one, and one of the things that we discussed was more research and more impact evaluations, especially in the humanitarian context. And one of the things I came back with to Nigeria was us conducting more impact evaluations in the humanitarian context. And I would give an example of one of the program sector lead that we did have discussions on was nutrition. And I did have very good discussions with our nutrition lead regarding how we are conducting our activities around nutrition. how we are collecting data on food consumption scores. And usually you'd find that looking at humanitarian context, we go in, distribute food, conduct post-distribution monitoring. The outcomes for all food consumption score are usually good within that period of, I think this all of us can relate to, usually within that period of after food distribution. Now, come to the end line, what happens? Everything goes down for that particular indicator. So food for thought, I asked him, what really are we doing in terms of food consumption score? What are we doing in terms of ensuring that our activity is actually sustainable, in that when we withdraw, this participant is able to continuously provide all those food distribution groups. You find that one of the things that they're able to mention is, oh, we're giving out money, oh, we're doing agricultural trainings and things like that. So next thing you talk about is how about we conduct an impact evaluation to look at how our agricultural interventions layer on nutrition activities. Then they're like, okay, yeah, we could do it. And then you're like, okay, fine. We'll just analyze each variable on its own. Then that way we can see what variable is actually weak, and then see how best we can tighten these particular gaps that are actually missing. So you end up planting the seed inside the brain, food for thought. They think about it, they brainstorm about it. But at the same time, you're pushing for your own learning agenda, seeing how best our program interventions are actually doing in terms of realizing that particular project goal. But this person is actually thinking about their own particular sector and how they've been doing so far, and them not being able to achieve their particular outcomes, and seeing whether they can actually leverage on that learning study that you want to conduct to be able to improve their own particular outcomes. Because if they learn a thing or two, then that is a plus to their own sector. It's not, and to you as M&D or as the learning person, it's also a plus to you. But so it's a bit more of a win-win situation. You're providing incentive here, but at the same time, you're also getting something in terms of learning and evidence approaches to plow back into program implementation. Thank you.
Fantastic, Grace. Brenda, I see someone has a hand up. So rather than turning it to you, I'm going to quickly call on Cynthia. We have exactly 1 minute. Cynthia, come off mute.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me. I just wanted to follow up to Lloyd's comment about evaluation shifting really from trying to shift from accountability to learning. And I've really been trying to do that with the organization that I work in. And just an example, we just finished the 3-year Humanitarian Nexus project. So funding humanitarian food assistance, but layering in for the recovery and agricultural and livelihood development programming. And our evaluation, we did a year-long final evaluation, but it was a learning exercise. And so that was the project teams were actually doing their own reflections and learning, but it was a real effort to get at the beginning, like proposing this and say, okay, so you're going to be doing this, and it's going to be, we're doing mostly the outcome harvesting and most significant change story harvesting to look at how would they build, what was the evidence for resilience in project participants, and doing most significant change story harvesting processes. But it took a lot of teams. It's like, well, we can't do that. Like, we can't evaluate, like, how are we going to be accountable? It's like, no, this is about your team learning and understanding, really working with the communities and harvesting the stories and trying to make sense of these stories of what has changed. And it was really, I would really struggle with that mindset shift to being, this isn't about accountability. It's like, no, we had really great processes. We had so much data in the program over 3 years from the kind of accountability piece. It's like, we've got that. It's like, now there's a space to really dig in and learn. And it was a year-long process, but really like the richness for our partners, the implementing teams, being able to really shift for them to see, oh, we can gather these stories and we can really hear from the community in a really different way than they would have, just doing a standard survey. So, but it's getting that initial, that shift that you can do this, that there's room for accountability that has its place, but that evaluation can be so much more than that. And you can really try and create spaces for these dynamic learning experiences.
Cynthia, thank you so much for adding that. I think there's been a huge sea change among donors on this particular front over the last 5 to 10 years. We are short on time. I see your hand, Lloyd, and I see Jenny smiling because I need to hand it off to her. So I'm handing it over to Jenny.
That's okay. It's perfect because I was going to give Lloyd just a second here to discuss a little bit of the work that he does with HIAC. It's an associate award with IDEAL, and I think it's quite relevant to what we've talked about today. So Lloyd, please go ahead.
I'm actually going to have you share all that about HIAC in the follow-up email. But just to that point, I wanted to talk about accountability versus evaluation. As somebody who goes and reads all the BHA and USA rules and regs around monitoring and evaluation, know that the evaluation requirement for humanitarian activity does not require you to evaluate an entire program, an entire activity. You are allowed to zoom in and study, research, evaluate parts of packages of your activity. So you can look at just the WASH component. You don't have to look across all of the sectors. Like your team can choose where to optimize its learning with that budget line item. And that's a fearful thing for leaders to do sometimes, to say, well, how do I evaluate the whole program? You don't need to. It's not required. Obviously, have a conversation with the AOR, but I just want to leave everyone with that. Like, it's not required in BHA to evaluate an entire humanitarian program. So that's all. Jenny, over to you.
All right, thank you. All right, so we have 1 minute for me to close out. I think this was, it was a bit of a risky, I'd say, meeting format, because we started out with breakout rooms, and I think sometimes in these virtual environments, people are a little bit nervous to speak and to come off mute. But I was very excited to have everybody in my group participate, and I hope it was the same for all of the other groups. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody here who shared their perspective, and also the really fantastic questions and shares that we received in the discussion portion as well. That was wonderful. All right, so real quick, we would love to hear from you guys in terms of how you felt this meeting went. I loved it, but we need to know from you. So I'm gonna have Elisa drop in the chat a link to a survey. So please fill out this survey and let us know how this hit for you. Give us any suggestions you have for how it could be improved in the future. We always take that information into account. It's one of the reasons that this meeting was much more interactive, because we received feedback that people wanted to interact. So we tried it. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email after this, probably in about 4 or 5 days, with just extra information. Keep a lookout for that. If you would like to come to our next meeting, you can join our listserv. So please, please follow the link that Elisa is going to put into the chat to join our listserv. We send out announcements directly through there. And our next meeting will be in August. So we're 1 minute over. Thank you very much. I loved this meeting today, and I can't wait to see what happens next time. So thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.
Thanks all.